The numbers on the page were wrong. Not slightly wrong, wrong in a way that someone had worked very hard to make look right. Calvin Ostrander noticed it the way he noticed most things, quietly, without moving, without changing the expression on his face. He was standing near the coffee station at the far end of the conference room, on the 42nd floor of a building he had no business being in. Except that someone had to bring up the refreshments, and he was the one who'd offered to do it. He set the carafe down carefully. He straightened the sugar packets, and he kept his eyes on the projection screen at the front of the room. The hotel was called the Parish, and it sat at the corner of Bay and Wellington in downtown Toronto, like it had been there since before the street existed. 12 floors of limestone and dark glass, a lobby that smelled of cedar and old money, a restaurant on the second floor that held 2 Michelin stars and a 3-week wait list. Calvin had worked there for 6 years. He drove the executive shuttle, a black Suburban with heated seats and a Sirius radio subscription, ferrying guests between the hotel and the financial district, the airport, the convention centers. He knew every construction detour between Pearson and Union Station. He knew which guests wanted silence and which ones wanted to talk. He knew the name of every person who mattered in that building, and he knew how to be invisible to all of them. That was the job. That was how he liked it. His daughter, Isabel, thought the job was beneath him. She was 26 and worked in marketing and said things like, "You could be doing so much more." Dad in the tone of someone who didn't yet understand that more was not always the point. She didn't know what he had done before the hotel, not really. He had told her some of it, enough to explain why he'd left Bay Street at 51, why he'd walked away from a corner office and a salary that would have made her eyes go wide, why he'd chosen, deliberately and without regret, to drive a car for a living. He hadn't told her about the years before that. He rarely told anyone. He was 58 now. He wore the same dark jacket every shift, kept a spare tie in the glove box that he'd never once used, and drove with both hands on the wheel. The guests who noticed him at all thought he was a man who had never been anything other than what he appeared to be. That was fine. That was exactly what he wanted. Margot Calloway arrived at the Parish on a Tuesday in November, traveling with a carry-on bag and a laptop case, and the particular kind of tiredness that comes not from lack of sleep, but from carrying too much for too long. She was 44 years old, the founder and CEO of a logistics technology company called Revell Systems, and she was in Toronto to close the most important deal of her professional life. Calvin had been asked to drive her that evening from the airport. He'd held the sign at arrivals, Calloway, M., and she had walked toward him with the focused stride of someone whose internal calendar was already running 3 moves ahead. "Thank you," she said, meaning it, which he noticed. A lot of people said it without meaning it. He took her bag. He held the door. He drove. She made 2 phone calls on the way in. He heard both of them without appearing to listen, the way he heard everything. One call was to someone named Paul, her CFO, he gathered, or maybe her general counsel. And she was walking through numbers, talking about the terms of a share structure agreement, asking Paul whether the clause they'd revised that morning would hold up if the other side pushed back on valuation timing. The second call was shorter. When she hung up, she looked out the window at the expressway lights smearing past in the rain and said nothing for a long time. "Long flight?" Calvin asked, because sometimes people needed permission to stop working. She looked at him in the mirror. "Long year," she said. He nodded and drove and didn't push it. That was the whole art of the job, really. Knowing when the door was open and when it wasn't. Revell Systems had built its reputation on supply chain software. The kind that mapped logistics networks in real time, rerouted around bottlenecks before they happened, and saved mid-sized manufacturers the kind of money that made the software essentially sell itself. Margot had started it in her garage in Hamilton, with 2 developers and a line of credit she'd gotten by mortgaging the house she'd inherited from her mother. 11 years later, Revell had 300 employees, offices in 4 provinces, and a platform that was used by over 200 clients across North America. And now Sanderson Industrial, one of the largest private equity firms in the country, wanted to acquire it. The deal had been in negotiation for 4 months. Sanderson had sent a team, their lead acquisition partner, a man named Bryce Whitfield, and his financial analyst and the firm's outside legal counsel. Revell had its own team, Paul Gauthier, the CFO, a lawyer named Stephanie Ng, and Margot herself, who was the kind of founder who read every line of every document herself and still remembered what the footnotes said a week later. But there was a third party at the table, and that was where the trouble was. Sanderson had brought in an outside consultant, a financial due diligence specialist named Wesley Crane, to verify Revell's numbers and produce an independent assessment of the company's value. It was standard practice. It was also the thing that was going to cost Margot Calloway everything, if no one noticed what Calvin Ostrander had already noticed. He had been asked to serve the conference room on Wednesday morning because the hotel's regular banquet staff was short. 2 people, a flu, had gone through the kitchen that week, and when the manager had come to him on his break to ask whether he'd be willing to help out for a few hours, Calvin had said yes without hesitating. He didn't need the extra shift. He said yes because that was the kind of man he was. He saw a gap and he filled it, quietly, without making it about himself. So he had been there at the back of the room setting up the coffee service when Wesley Crane began his presentation. The slides were clean and professional. Crane was smooth, polished in the way of someone who had spent a long time learning to sound authoritative regardless of whether he was right. He walked the room through Revell's financials with the confidence of a man who expected no one to check his math. Calvin checked his math not openly. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back near the credenza, and he read the numbers on the screen the way he had read numbers for the first 22 years of his professional life. As a forensic accountant, then as a senior partner at a firm on King Street that had, among other things, been retained by the Ontario Securities Commission to investigate financial fraud in 3 separate cases that had made the front page of the Globe and Mail. He had been the one who built the models. He had been the one who found the discrepancies that other people had missed, or chosen not to see. He had left that life at 51, after a case that had taken 3 years of his life and cost him his marriage, and left him sitting alone in an apartment on St. Clair, with the distinct and certain sense that he had run out of things worth spending himself on. Isabel had been 20 at the time, already in university, already fine. He had sold the apartment, bought a small house in Etobicoke, and applied for a job driving the hotel shuttle because someone he'd once done tax work for had mentioned the hotel was hiring, and he had been in the right state of mind to take that as a sign. He had not looked at a set of financial projections in 7 years, until now. The error wasn't in the revenue figures. That was the elegant part. The revenue figures were clean, almost conspicuously so, the kind of numbers that invited scrutiny because they could withstand it. The problem was in the adjusted EBITDA projection for years 3 through 5 of the post-acquisition integration model. Crane had applied a margin expansion assumption of 4.2% per year, which on the surface was aggressive but defensible. What was not defensible? What was, in Calvin's assessment, either a profound error or a deliberate misrepresentation, was the way Crane had calculated the base to which that margin was applied. He had used a gross revenue figure that included a category of deferred client contracts that Revell had flagged in its own disclosure documents as contingent, meaning they weren't guaranteed revenue, they were potential revenue, dependent on client decisions that hadn't been made yet. Margot's own CFO had been careful to label them correctly. Crane had taken those numbers, shifted them into the base calculation without notation, and used them as if they were confirmed. The effect was to inflate Revell's projected value by somewhere in the range of $18 to $22 million. Sanderson was offering to acquire Revell for a price built on that inflated number. But the deal structure, and this was what Calvin caught when Crane moved to the second half of his presentation, included a performance earn-out clause. Margot would receive a portion of the purchase price up front, and the remainder would be paid out over 3 years based on whether Revell hit the projected margins. Margins that had been calculated, in part, using revenue that wasn't actually confirmed. If the contingent contracts didn't convert, and some of them wouldn't, that was the nature of contingent contracts. Margot would miss the earn-out targets through no fault of her company's performance. She would receive significantly less than the headline number she had been told she was selling for, and she would have signed the agreement based on projections that made the shortfall look like her failure rather than a flaw in the model. Calvin stood very still near the credenza and looked at the screen and thought about what to do. He had no relationship with Margot Calloway beyond the 40 minutes he had spent driving her from the airport. He was not her lawyer, not her accountant, not anyone whose role gave him standing to speak in this room. He was the man who had brought the coffee. He poured a cup and walked slowly to the end of the table where Bryce Whitfield was making a note on a yellow legal pad, and he set a cup near the edge, the way you do when you're simply doing your job, the way that makes you invisible. On his way back, he passed behind Stephanie Ng, Ravel's lawyer, who was scrolling through something on her tablet. He passed behind Paul Gauthier, who was watching Crane's slides with the expression of a man who was almost convinced. He walked to the door, stepped into the corridor, and took out his phone. He had Margot's contact information because the hotel kept records of executive shuttle clients. He stood in the hallway for a moment, looking at her name on his screen, and thought about what it would cost him if he was wrong, and what it would cost her if he said nothing. Then he typed, "Miss Calloway, this is Calvin, your driver from last evening. I apologize for the interruption. I'm outside the conference room. I need 5 minutes. It concerns the numbers in the current presentation. I would not ask if I didn't think it was important." He put the phone in his pocket and went back in and refilled 2 cups and stood where he had been standing before, and he waited. Margot felt her phone vibrate. She glanced down under the table with the practiced discretion of someone who had been in enough meetings to know how to read a message without appearing to. She read it twice. She looked toward the back of the room, found the driver standing near the credenza, the quiet one, the one who had asked about her flight the night before, and she looked at him for 2 full seconds before she looked away. She let 4 minutes pass. Then she leaned toward Paul and murmured something about needing to make a brief call, excused herself from the table in the unhurried way of someone managing something routine, and stepped into the corridor. Calvin was waiting 6 feet from the door. "What is it?" she said. Not hostile. She had the instincts of a person who learned long ago to take information seriously regardless of its source. "The margin expansion model," he said. "Crane is applying the 4.2% growth assumption to a base that includes your contingent contracts, the ones your disclosure documents flagged as conditional." She went very still. "He's treating approximately $19 million in unconfirmed pipeline as confirmed revenue," Calvin said. "The earn-out structure in the deal you've been presented ties your payout to hitting those projected margins. If those contracts don't fully convert, and you know better than I do whether they will, you won't hit the targets, and it won't be because your company underperformed." Margot was looking at him with an expression he couldn't read. "Who are you?" she said, and she didn't mean his name. "I drove for a living for 6 years," he said. "Before that, I was a forensic accountant. I worked financial fraud cases for the OSC for most of my career." He paused. "I'm not in that world anymore. I wasn't trying to be in that room, but I know what I saw." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "Can you put it in writing? Right now, the specific line items, what he used, what the correct base should be." "Yes," he said. She handed him her phone. It took him 11 minutes. He used the notes application and wrote in the shorthand of someone who had once written OSC disclosure summaries that ran to 40 pages, precise, numbered, referenced to the slide numbers he had memorized, and he handed the phone back to her, and she read it without speaking. When she finished, she read it again. "Go back inside," she said. "Don't leave." He went back inside. He refilled the cups that didn't need refilling. He stood where he had been standing and he watched. Margot Calloway walked back into the conference room and sat down and let Crane finish his presentation. She didn't show anything on her face. Not tension, not awareness, not the particular stillness of someone who has just been handed a grenade. She thanked him when he finished. She said Ravel would need 24 hours to review the integrated model internally before moving to final terms. Bryce Whitfield frowned slightly. "We were hoping to move toward a term sheet today." "I understand that," Margot said, "and I want to close this deal. But I'm a founder who has spent 11 years building something, and I'm not going to sign anything without giving my team the overnight to go through the numbers one more time." "I think that's reasonable." It was reasonable. There was nothing Whitfield could say to it that wouldn't sound unreasonable in turn. The meeting ended. People gathered their laptops and their folders. Calvin cleared the cups. That evening, Paul Gauthier worked through the model with the notes Margot had forwarded from her phone. He found what Calvin had described within the first hour. He found 2 additional issues in the second hour, smaller but in the same direction. The same pattern of treating uncertain figures as certain ones. By midnight, He had built a corrected model that revised Ravel's projected value down by 19 million from what Crane had presented. But that also, crucially, restructured the earnout targets against the corrected base, so that the headline acquisition price remained in the same range. In other words, Ravel was worth what Sanderson had said it was. Manipulation hadn't been about the total price. It had been about setting earnout targets Margot was structurally unable to hit, so that Sanderson would ultimately pay far less than the number on the term sheet. Stephanie Ng, when she saw the revised model, said 3 words: "We need documentation." They spent the rest of the night building it. The meeting the following morning was different. Margot came in with Paul and Stephanie and a 40-page document that Stephanie placed on the table in front of Bryce Whitfield without explanation. "We've reviewed the integrated model," Margot said. "We found some issues with the base assumptions in the earnout calculation. Our CFO has prepared a corrected version. We'd like to walk through it before we discuss next steps." Wesley Crane, who was seated to Whitfield's left, looked at the document and said nothing. His face did something careful and controlled. Calvin, standing at the back of the room with the coffee service again, because no one had told him to leave and he had not told anyone he was staying, watched Crane's hands. They were very still. Paul walked through the corrected model. It was methodical and thorough, and it left no room for the kind of ambiguity that might allow the original figures to be defended as a misunderstanding. When he reached slide 14, which compared the 2 versions of the earnout base calculation side by side, there was a silence in the room that had its own texture. Whitfield looked at Crane. Crane said that the contingent contracts had been included based on guidance from Ravel's own CRM data. Paul said that Ravel's own disclosure documents, which had been in Sanderson's possession for 2 months, explicitly categorized those contracts as conditional pipeline, not confirmed revenue. Another silence. Whitfield said they would need to step out and confer. They stepped out. Crane did not look at Margot when he left the room. He did not look at anyone. The deal was restructured over the following 2 weeks. Sanderson retained a different financial consultant, a firm from Montreal that Margot's lawyer had suggested, and the new due diligence process used the corrected base figures from the start. The final acquisition price came in slightly above Sanderson's original offer, because the earn-out terms were now calculated honestly against numbers that Ravel could actually hit, and Sanderson's own internal team, once they understood what had happened, had a strong incentive to demonstrate good faith. Wesley Crane was not part of the restructured negotiations. He was not retained by Sanderson again. What happened to him professionally after that was not Calvin's concern, though he heard something about it, months later, in a way that suggested it had not gone well. Margot called the hotel 2 days after the second meeting. She asked to speak to the manager, and she asked the manager whether it would be appropriate for her to speak with the driver, Calvin, the one who had been on her shuttle from the airport. The manager, who was used to guests calling with complaints, found the call somewhat disorienting and said he would pass the message along. Calvin took the call that afternoon in the staff break room, a cup of tea cooling on the table in front of him. "I don't know how to thank you properly," Margot said. "You don't need to," he said. "No, I do. I want to understand something first, though. Why didn't you just tell my CFO or my lawyer? Why did you come to me directly?" He thought about that. "Because it was your company," he said. 11 years of your life. I thought you deserved to know before anyone else did." She was quiet for a moment. "Paul asked me who the source was. I told him it was someone with the right background who'd happened to be in the room." "That's accurate," Calvin said. "He wants to know if you'd be willing to consult on the post-acquisition integration, just to have a second set of eyes on things going forward." Calvin looked at his tea. He thought about the drive from the airport in the rain. He thought about what she'd said when he'd asked about the flight. Long year. He thought about what it meant to build something for 11 years and almost lose it to a number that had been quietly, precisely, moved from one column to another. "I'd need to think about it," he said. "That's fair," she said. He drove 3 more shuttle runs that week. He took Isabel to dinner on Saturday, and she told him about a campaign she was working on, and he listened the way he always did, completely without looking at his phone. On the drive home, she said, in her usual way, that she sometimes worried he wasn't challenged enough. He told her he was fine. He drove home in the dark and sat for a moment in the driveway before going inside, and he thought about a set of numbers on a conference room screen, and the particular feeling of seeing something that others had missed, and the weight of deciding what to do with it. He had not missed that feeling exactly. He had not known it was still there. He called Margot Calloway the following Monday. He told her he would take the consulting work, part-time, his terms no title, no office, just the numbers. She said that was exactly what she had hoped he would say. He thanked her and hung up and went out to start the Suburban, because there was an early pickup at the airport and he was never late, and that was still true, and would remain true, regardless of what else he happened to be. Some things about a person don't change. They just wait quietly for the moment when they're needed again.